Africans have already been doing in terms of addressing and fighting climate change by protecting their communities across the continent and addressing a number of issues, including driving clean energy and supporting climate action in cities, preserving ocean ecosystems. And as we all know, the first Nobel Prize for Peace for an African woman was Wangari Maathai for her climate work, and that was a while ago. So in this discussion around emergency, one thing that we have agreed we don't want to lose is the contributions that Africans have been making and already making, and how important it is, as the panel on narratives discussed, in amplifying the work that we're doing while we're looking at ways to find new solutions. I wanted to begin just highlighting some of the topics that came up yesterday in the other panels, because there was a lot of conversation about inclusion of women, but also around climate. And one of the mandates for this panel was encouraging the development of a shared vision for strategic philanthropy and mitigating climate change across the continent. And on this panel, we hope to discuss and explore how African philanthropy can fill the gaps and play a more prominent role, and how we amplify how we are playing that role. I heard a lot about supporting the next generation of African leaders and change makers in the climate sector. The opening panel around the future of work and what that means and green jobs discussed that. We also wanted to highlight opportunities for philanthropists in this space on connecting and collaborating. Highlight ways in which we can promote sustainable economic development and economic empowerment by accelerating gender equality and improving gender equity in finance. And also, because we are convened in this beautiful city, where Yusuf is from, he'll tell you about that in a bit, just creating opportunities to collaborate and network with the broader community that's here, and to engage in meaningful conversation about sustainability, social impact, and governance. And then finally, finding out ways in which we can reaffirm our collective commitment to supporting African leaders and philanthropists in sustainable finance. So we had an ambitious briefing to discuss climate, and there are a lot of issues. And because I have two experts who come from the finance space, we are going to lean a little bit more towards climate finance, but we're also going to flip the script a little bit and allow for more participation from you, the audience, who are also the experts. And so we will open it up for not just questions, but also comments and observations, and for you to share some of your work. And we will have questions for you as well. We were debating on whether or not we'd have the audience do the opening dance, but I think Yinka stole our thunder by starting with music that everybody was singing along to. So Aisha, I'm going to just start with you. If you don't mind telling us a little bit about your work, and especially your work on climate.
Thank you, Agwil, and good morning, everyone. Yesterday was so insightful and interesting, and I just want to congratulate the African Philanthropy Forum for an amazing, amazing conference. My background is in finance. I've spent almost 3 decades working in private financial markets and as a financial regulator and policymaker. I've also been very privileged to be involved in gender-related, gender advocacy work. And I think that background has given me a keen appreciation of the challenges that Africa faces, but more importantly, how finance can fix those challenges. So my work with climate as a regulator was from 3 areas. First, I looked at climate-related financial risk and the impact on bank balance sheets and financial stability. Then we looked at how we could use, say, inclusive green finance, financial inclusion to make vulnerable communities more resilient, say women and rural areas when you have a climate event. And then finally, we used to consider if central banks can be using their convening power to really shed light and focus on climate finance and its issues. More recently, I'm more excited because since leaving the central bank, I've been involved in research on climate from a broader perspective. I'm looking at, of course, the challenges with finance, which Yusuf will talk about, but more importantly for me, I think the narrative needs to change a bit. I see, looking from the outside in, I see a lot of conversation about, okay, the lack of finance, the fact that Africa is not contributing to greenhouse gases, the fact that we didn't do this, we didn't cause this, but we are most vulnerable. I think our narrative needs to change to one that is more proactive, more powerful. So looking at climate not as a development issue, but as a development opportunity. There's been conversation about whether government should focus on short-term issues like poverty alleviation, job creation versus climate. I see this as a continuum. I think climate finance can be the route to solving our development issues and not a priority that we need to decide either or. And I think African philanthropy has a big part to play as well in this, because we know where the gaps are, and later on I'll talk about how they can do that. But one sort of obvious opportunity is how African philanthropy can de-risk these kinds of investments. So even when you're not talking about climate, you're talking about entrepreneurship, you're talking about investment. Africa is always seen as a very risky destination. And it's really difficult for us to shake off that toga. But I think using instruments that are innovative, like First Loss Capital, can actually assist with that. So I'm really, really excited about this conversation, as you can see, and I look forward to another opportunity to share more.
Thank you so much, Aisha. We are really excited to hear more from you as well. So Yusuf, before you tell us a little bit about your work, maybe you can tell us a bit about where you're from.
Thank you, Agil. Yes, so I'm from Marrakesh. I'm probably the only one, maybe, in a participant that is from the city, and I hope you're enjoying the beautiful red city. By the way, today we had the first layer of snow over the Atlas Mountains, so this is a very special week for the city. And yesterday we had rain. Doesn't rain much in the city of Marrakesh. So I was saying to Aguil and to the colleagues that the forum and the conference is such a good omen for the city. So welcome again to the city of Marrakesh. So my name is Youssef Boumez. I'm actually working at the UNEP Finance Initiative, which is called UNEP FI. So UNEP Finance Initiative is the UN, say, convened network of banks, insurers, investors that are committed to drive the sustainable finance agenda worldwide. I work actually as a climate coordinator for UNEP-FI, covering the Africa region as well as the Middle East region. So I work closely with regulators, mentioned by my colleague Aisha, as well as banks, insurers, investors, I would say, supporting their net zero journey, as well as climate mitigation efforts and sustainable finance. We do that through, I would say, capacity building, engagement activities, as well as convening, I would say, institutions that work in the field. So yeah, just to maybe some observations before we dive in. I think I'll be focusing more on the share of the private sector climate financing that is still low, and hence this requires the de-risking mechanisms that were mentioned by Aisha. So afterwards we will, I'd say, provide a landscape of climate finance flows in Africa, also how the private sector is low and where philanthropists can come in and provide their support. Also, I'll showcase some of the work we as an organization can support in this. So yeah, again, very happy to be here, and thanks again to APF and also Bloomberg Africa for the moderation. Yeah, I look forward to also engaging more with you. Thanks.
Thank you, Yusuf. And so Aisha, I'm going to start with you for the first question. As you rightly mentioned, we have been hearing over the past few days about the disproportionate impact of climate and the climate emergency on women and on Africans. UNEP estimates that 80% of people displaced by climate change are women and girls. And you talked about, and we've heard from the other panels, how women are also critical stakeholders in designing and implementing solutions to address the climate emergency. And so if we're thinking in terms of equitable climate action, we also need to find ways to address a disproportionate impact, not just on Africans, but on women. Because that's where the success of any of our interventions would lie. Given your experience in the financial sector, if we're saying that the diversity of the sector as a whole is going to be important, especially including women, right, and inclusion, to any of the successes that we want to achieve in addressing climate, would you say from your experience that women are valued as key stakeholders in the industry to drive, and what would be required to have women be driving more significant impact in climate target and including them in even any of the business outcomes for some of the organizations that you would have regulated as a central banker?
Okay. It's a long question.
It is. I was trying to give you scope to cover all the things that you wanted to.
Okay, let me just start with talking about Financial Alliance for Women, because I didn't do that in the beginning. So I'm a board member of the Alliance, and our view at the Alliance is that we have about $6 trillion in potential value add to the global economy that can come from female entrepreneurs and female businesses. And what the Alliance does is to bring together financial institutions and policymakers that are looking to harness this opportunity. I cannot overemphasize, the advantages of getting women more included. And our view on climate and climate action, I think when I say it should be a development opportunity, I mean that we should be seeking to achieve several goals, not just mitigation, not just reducing emissions, but to solve for economic inclusion, economic empowerment, etc. Now, to your question, are women valued? Yes and no. There's a lot of conversation about the fact that women and children, I must say, are disproportionately affected. And the reason, is briefly, the caregivers, many of these women are in rural areas. Women form a huge percentage of the informal agricultural sector, and usually climate-related issues have an agricultural bent, and this is the reason. Those in rural areas that have to sort of walk distances to get water, for example, they have to walk longer, they are at risk of many different things, and that's the reason why women are more at risk. But that's not the entire story. Women are also involved in the solution. And that's why I say yes and no. So yes, they're disproportionately affected, but they're involved in solution from two areas. I think the first is women are increasingly involved in the community-based solutions that are being implemented. I think yesterday we were talking with Erelu about how, climate-related solutions should be locally driven. They should be locally relevant. Now, to get that relevance in, you need women, because women have an appreciation of how those initiatives will work or will not work, because they are disproportionately affected. Research has shown that, of course, in the corporate sector, there's enough research that shows that diverse boards make better decisions, and so because of that, they make more money and they're more financially sustainable. In the same way on the policy side, not enough research, but there is evidence that if you put a woman in charge of financial policy and economic policy, she's more likely to create a policy that is more inclusive, and that is why we need women at the forefront. So it's not just about equity, it's about effectiveness. So African philanthropists are bringing their money in, they want to see impact. To make that impact work, you need women at the forefront. The third part is about women making financial decisions. And yesterday, I was so excited when I heard Kuramo Capital and Moremi Fund. I was almost jumping out of my seat, because that's what we want. We want women to be sitting making those decisions. Usually when they are at the table, they tend to think more holistically. So I thought I'd give some examples so that we know that, okay, these things are happening. Country examples, Morocco. So I keep hearing about the Noor power project, which is one of the largest globally. But for me, what was exciting about it is that it has a deliberate percentage of female workers that they're looking at. So they're training women to work in these power plants. Many of these plants are in rural areas. Mm-hmm. And it's dedicated. And so it's creating, so first of all, we're reducing emissions. Second of all, we're empowering women. Third of all, we are even stimulating girls to be involved in STEM. the perfect example of how you can use a climate-related initiative to address several objectives. In Kenya, you have something called the Solar Sister. I like the name, Solar Sister. 5,000 female entrepreneurs being trained to sell sort of solar panels and all that in rural areas. We impacted about 1.5 million people. But so that is in community-based access. I'm very proud of some of our African sisters. I was talking to you about Tariye, for example. She's leading the Climate Investment Fund, $12 billion, and she's making key decisions on policy and on attracting finance. There's another lady, young lady, Damilola. Mm-hmm. Sorry, these two are Nigerian, so let me give you another example.
See for all, yes.
Yes. Okay, Vera Songwe, for example. She's transited into, she's the UN rep on climate. So that is to tell you that women really are at the forefront of policy. And there's so many other women that are in the private sector. They are leading sustainability efforts and visible. So what should we do? We need more women at the helm. I'm proud to say in Nigeria, in financial sector, I think we have the largest, I don't know of any other African country that has the largest number of women leading financial institutions, 25% CEOs. That's what we need. Not just for these women to direct funding to these areas, but those institutions tend to be more inclusive broadly. And in terms of sustainability and ESG considerations, they tend to be more involved and holistic. So we need to do more, but we have achieved something, and we need to see more of these examples. Thanks.
Thanks, Sasha. So also in the spirit of how we include the diaspora, we're also including examples of Africans leading global institutions that are addressing climate, along with African philanthropy. So Yusuf, just to kind of dive in a little bit more about what Aisha was saying, why do you think it is important to finance climate action? And Aisha talked about de-risking and some other concepts. Maybe in your answer, you can also give us a little bit about the state of climate finance in Africa.
Thank you so much, Agil. So before maybe let's say discussing the state of climate finance in the continent, I think there is need to define some of the maybe two concepts I will be saying again and again, which refers to climate mitigation, climate adaptation. So this will be like at the heart of perhaps maybe our responses with Aisha. So climate mitigation, if you hear this, it refers to all the actions that are taken, all the climate actions taken to reduce GHG emissions or CO2 emissions. Climate adaptation, which is very also relevant to the context of Africa, refers to how we adapt and adjust to the effects of climate change. So these concepts are, like I would say, key when it comes to climate finance. I want to mention one number, $44 billion. So this is the amount of climate financing that was mobilized in Africa in the past 2 years. So $44 billion comparing to the 3 to 4% share of Africa's Africa in the global GHG emissions. I think we are really far from what is needed. What is really needed is, I would say, around $250 billion yearly. We are now at 44. We need about more over, I'd say, $200 billion. To address all the climate financing needs of the countries, of the communities, I would say, across Africa. Also to translate the commitments that are, say, expressed by the countries in the national determined contributions indices into, I would say, action to address both mitigation and adaptation challenges. So yes, we're far from addressing this climate finance gap in Africa. But what's also striking is that in this $44 billion that is mobilized annually, most of it, I would say 85% of this amount comes from public sources. We know the debt burden of many African countries. We know that government cannot cover, I would say, all the climate finance gaps, while the private sector share remains very low at almost 15%. So we're talking about $6 billion only that are mobilized by the private by the private sectors. And within this $6 billion, I think there is a domination of corporates. Comes to large scale infrastructure projects like the Noor solar power plant, for instance. But when it comes to individuals, communities, MSMEs, I would say cooperatives coming in also providing their share, we're really far from, let's say, from an adequate amount that could address the climate finance needs. Also, I think on the positive side, I think I was mostly showcasing some of the challenges.
And to the point that you're talking about, what are some of the gaps that philanthropists can fill in that space between the public and private sector, especially African philanthropists?
So for African philanthropists, there's something very interesting is that when it comes to adaptation financing, so anything about water, ecosystems, vulnerable communities, to climate change, resilience of infrastructure, philanthropists make, I would say, 90% of the adaptation financing coming from private sources. So this is very interesting. This is very positive. However, still, I would say there is a gap when it comes to supporting the mitigation actions for coming from MSMEs, coming from corporates, coming from cooperatives. I think that's also where there is still a gap. That's the area I believe African philanthropists can fill that gap. And what's needed is, I think, mentioned also by my colleague Aisha, de-risking. I think there is potential here to work on how we can absorb that available financing, because this $44 billion that I mentioned, it is available, but it doesn't mean it was channeled or dispersed. So I think there's need to support African private sector organizations, corporates, MSMEs, SMEs in absorbing that financing. And to absorb that financing, you need all the capacity building behind, technical, expertise behind the skills and know-how, the education. You need to engage, I would say, women. You need to engage young people in this journey. Yeah, so I'll stop here.
Okay.
Maybe later we can come.
Yes, no, of course. Thank you for that. That helps clarify a little bit of some of the concepts that we keep hearing. So I should, yeah, please.
Just to pick up from what you said about the challenges with technical capacity, I think not just philanthropy. So blended finance is good, public-private philanthropy. But we shouldn't forget financial institutions and banks, because they come in with the kinds of technical expertise and access that can be very beneficial for these types of transactions. I think another challenge is accountability. There's this perception that monies that come into Africa they're not able to really account for how they're used and their impact and all of that. You know, we don't have enough. Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. We don't have enough examples of, African philanthropic collaborations, that can actually help us unlock the capital. And I like what you said about the fact that the money is there, but we're not accessing it. A great example is what BlackRock is doing with some other philanthropic organizations, where they're actually trying to de-risk through first loss. So first loss capital is essentially trying to, because most institutional and private investors don't want to take full risk on the full spectrum. So first loss capital helps to, say, provide comfort, for these institutions and these private investors. So that could work. There's a recent investment in Nigeria, I think by USAID and Norfund, that is trying to do that as well. And we shouldn't also forget some of the challenges around not just the risk, because most of these projects are actually bankable. Mm-hmm. But there's also FX risk and devaluation. So in local currency, the project is bankable, but in US dollars, it doesn't look bankable. So you need that concessionary financing, and that's where it can come in. I think there are a few lessons that you can learn from the financial sector in this. So if you look at, regulatory frameworks like Basel III and the concept of microfinance, when it first started, it looked like it was very expensive because Basel III was additional capital requirements. But over the long term, it made financial stability better, and then we saw the value. And today, we've all seen the value of microfinance, when in the beginning it wasn't really bankable. I think another, lesson we can learn from financial sector is when we're trying to get banks to lend to agriculture. It was like pulling teeth. Very high risk, not enough insurance, and that was really where you saw de-risking institutions and de-risking transactions, and you can learn from that. And I think finally you can learn from the banking sector's collaboration with their regulators on financial inclusion. I know there's a lot of conversation, and I love what APF is doing because it's bringing these conversations to the forefront, but we need more of an ecosystem-wide sort of collaborative platform. And I think where financial inclusion, the achievements of financial inclusion globally has been as a result of that global collaboration. I think those are lessons we can learn. Nigeria was the pioneer on green bonds. That's a huge financial innovation, the pioneer in Africa on green bonds that I think the continent can learn from as well.
Exactly. So you've provided us some examples of bold leadership decisions and bold decisions to undertake projects that led to transformational change. And so I'm going to give a chance for the audience to either comment or answer questions, because when we were having our conversations, we were thinking about ways in which we can encourage funders and philanthropists to participate in actively addressing climate change. And so just to hear back from the audience based on what our esteemed panelists have been talking about, what are some examples of bold leadership that have led to transformative change in climate, or what are examples maybe in other sectors that have lessons that we can distill in the way in which philanthropists and even just Africans ourselves address climate change on the continent? And if you don't have an answer to the question, but you have a burning comment, we'll still take that as well, because I just wanted to make sure you're able to participate. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you. I'm Nada Barada. I'm Youth Workforce and Climate Coordinator at EDC. I'm really glad you highlighted the importance of funding climate mitigation and adaptation. I'm wondering if you can talk a bit more about loss and damage as well. I know, again, many communities and individuals, farmers and others, are going to be accentuatedly affected by losing a lot of their land, houses, schools, etc. So what is the space for that? And I want us also to sit with how low the investments of climate finance is for a lot of communities that do send it. I do agree that we need to be optimistic about it and have sort of a perspective of we can do and build better in ways that can support the communities. I love that you all also highlighted that we cannot solve climate without also continuing our battles to alleviate poverty and improving education, providing work opportunities, and that one sort of quest does not diminish from the other, but helps supports it. So just wanted to thank you for that.
Thank you. Do you want to take the lost and damaged question? Okay. Different, okay.
So he's the climate expert. So this issue about narratives and framing, I think this loss and damage fund for me hasn't really empowered Africa. It's put us in a perspective where we're victims and we need to sort of be compensated, for that. And I don't think it has achieved what it meant to attract the Western world to really fund this. I think, so it's important. I would focus more on adaptation investments, and while philanthropy is, overwhelmingly present in adaptation, we still need about $300 billion, I think, by 2030 on adaptation. So it's still not enough. And so I'd rather we focus on getting more of that, and that way we can achieve so much more. But yes, vulnerable communities, just transition, very important. I think about almost 1 billion Africans are still using sort of biomass, I think, for energy. We still have energy security issues, so it's a kaleidoscope of challenges, but I see it as an opportunity to tick 10 boxes with sort of the finance we get.
Yusuf, you want to add to that?
Yeah, just to add to Aisha, I think, yes, definitely loss and damage fund. I think it was maybe it was a revolution. It's been let's say years that during the COPs countries were fighting for this. But I think just to echo what Aisha said, if we're just going back to the same format where only public finance is mobilized through that loss and damage funds, I think we'll be back to square zero. What's needed is to mobilize the private sector in addressing adaptation needs. So what we do, for instance, just at UNIPIFA, we work on local relevance. I think it was mentioned by Aisha. Work with local banks in building their internal technical capabilities in their climate mitigation journey, so that they can, as a result, support their clients and customers. So we work mostly with national commercial banks in Africa and building that capacity so that they can provide adequate financial instruments to address the climate needs. It is true that mitigation has been, I would say, the subsector that absorbed most of the financing because of the bankability. It's actually, there is a financial and commercial approach in the sector. However, adaptation, private financing is lagging because of the lack of bankability. It is not a sector that generates returns and profits to the investors and to the banks. So we're working also with the banks on how they can actually find ways to finance some of the adaptation projects using their commercial private financing. So again, just to sum up, loss and damage, great, but I think if we mobilize the private sector in this, in mobilizing these funds, in channeling these funds, but also in, I would say, creating the demand for these funds, which goes back to our discussion on supporting the design and development of bankable projects that can absorb that financing.
Thank you. And so we've got a couple of hands up, and we are convening, and you mentioned convening regulators, investors, different sectors, and so I think Mavis is probably going to be the perfect person to comment on. So Mavis, go ahead.
So thank you, Mavis Owusi Jennifer from the African Center for Economic Transformation. I had a couple of questions for the panel. The first one was that we hear a lot that we don't have a healthy pipeline of bankable projects in the climate space, and that's why we are not attracting investment. It would be great to hear your views on that. My second question is really around sources of finance. Carbon credits and nature finance are two areas where there's real opportunity for Africa to generate its own resources, but we don't seem to have made progress in that space. So we'd love to hear your views on that as well. Thank you.
Okay. So you can do pipeline? Yielded carbon? Okay. And then there was another question. You wanted, okay, well, should we take that question and then you'll answer? Go ahead. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Amy Galland, Empower Venture Partners. And my question is, sorry, over here, I see you looking. Hi. So my question is, you're talking about private finance and pipelines and money, but what work are you also doing? Because we do see a lot of governments, sort of using the energy access gaps as an excuse to invest, and with a lot of private and development capital into these fossil fuel projects. So how are you working both to pressure, not just, here's a bankable project, to actually to be pressuring the private finance community and the governments, and potentially collaborate with activists on the ground to stop these types of projects? Like, how are those collaborations going as well?
All right, so the first question on bankable,
Unbankable?
yeah.
Okay. Pipeline bankable. I think bankable projects, I think, is where I focus. I think there's a healthy pipeline, and it's easy to create, with through test and learn and pilot projects, and there are a lot of pilot projects that have been run, but those projects don't scale because of some of the challenges you mentioned earlier. The the perception of technical capacity, the lack of local knowledge. And that's why, philanthropic collaborations need to work with local institutions to give them that sense of comfort. It's all about risk and the perception of risk. In the past, we've not worked very hard to address risk. So we just throw money at it and just put a high interest rate in there and that addresses risk. But it doesn't do that. So my view is that the projects are there and they're visible. We just need innovation and leadership and commitment to create them and sustain them. That would be my view. And that's an excellent question on the fossil fuel. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if I have the answers for that, because on the one hand, we have 48% of Africans don't have access to electricity. So when you put that in place and you look at, African economies trying to industrialize, trying to create a free trade area that is beneficial to the world, have this argument about whether we shouldn't be doing that. For me, I think a lot of the solar projects coming up can address energy needs in a clean way. And I think that's what we should focus more on. I'm sure you have.
Yeah. And so you can do the carbon,
Yeah,
and then
that's fine
we'll
too.
try to answer the question around, we'll start and then you can.
Yeah, just on the carbon market, it is indeed a powerful, market and tool for climate change mitigation. Just with a caveat that integrity, challenges are addressed. I think also so far the carbon market has been responding to, large or has been, translated into large infrastructure projects or large conservation projects. But yet, I think there is still a gap when it comes to opening the carbon market to smaller players. I think that's maybe where also African philanthropists can play a role in building that, the technical expertise in supporting the availability of data that is needed for that, and also supporting the governance / integrity and accountability readiness of these smaller players, smaller in size, but they can have a bigger impact even than larger projects in the field of carbon markets. Maybe just also on the role of governments. I think it was a powerful question. Just maybe to showcase that some of the regulations now are emerging in the field of sustainable finance. A lot of countries now are actually constrained by the emergence of these global, regulations and policies. I refer, for instance, to the European Union Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which will be actually a burden on African exports of certain products that are energy and carbon intensive. We're talking about aluminium, we're talking about cement, we're talking about fertilizers, electricity exports, etc. So I think we shouldn't also put so much pressure on African countries, because they're both constrained by the climate change or the climate finance mitigation needs, as well as the now emerging and evolving policies. And what we work at this at Unify, we actually convene a set of frameworks that are the foremost norms and frameworks used when it comes to sustainable finance, the principles for responsible banking, the principles for sustainable insurance, the Net Zero Banking Alliance. So all of these frameworks, we convene them, we build the technical capacity of banks so that they can address both these climate finance gaps and challenges, as well as the evolving, public policies and guidelines and international regulations that affect the countries.
Can I just ask you, so are you saying that these new rules would make African exports that are carbon intensive more expensive or more uncompetitive? Is that what you're saying?
Actually, we're talking in simple terms, we're talking about a carbon tax imposed by the European Union when it comes to certain products that are, I would say, produced outside of the EU. So let's say, for instance, you're producing a ton of cement. If this ton of cement is, I would say, emits more than a ton of cement produced within the EU, you will have to pay that difference as a tax. So this is actually a burden potentially could be a burden on African exports, but an opportunity because let's not forget that global energy transition needs also Africa with all the, let's say, the potential in renewable energy, green hydrogen. So it is both a burden, but also a source of opportunity.
I just wanted to go back to her question in terms of how do you counter the pressure from different industries? And so, considering the people that we're convening, you were a regulator, you're working in the finance space. What are things that philanthropists and nonprofits and other activists can do to either counter the pressure or maybe from your regulator's perspective, what are certain legislations that can be passed to encourage, especially for pension funds and stuff, to encourage green investment?
Okay. I thought you were going to come at it from the perspective of political will, because she mentioned that.
That's true.
One area that I didn't mention was that African philanthropy, private philanthropy can help the advocacy that's required. Because, pressure groups, community groups involving sort of the entire ecosystem and framing, this issue of framing, we just have to keep talking about it. Framing this climate issue as a development opportunity and getting citizens to actually expect more from their government, I think would really good. Legislation has its place. We talked about it yesterday when we were talking about gender justice. I loved that panel because there is legislation, but we don't see much activity on ground, or we are not making as much progress as we expect. So I cannot overemphasize how we have to win hearts and minds in this respect. And it needs money, because you need media, you need social media, you need all of these sort of engagements. I think would be powerful.
And, okay, over there, and then over there.
Thank you very much, speakers, for your submissions this morning. It's been very useful. My name is Harriet Mr. Arthur. I'm representing a private university in Ghana, Liberal Arts University, Ashesi University, that's focused on developing young leaders for the continent. One of the things this university has been doing is developing entrepreneurs as well. So within the university's curriculum, they have an entrepreneurship hub. Now, one of the questions in my day job, I'm an energy consultant, and I've done this work for almost 40 years. Now, one of the big issues we have on the continent in having entrepreneurs make progress is on the governance and policy side. One policy from government and everything is thrown out. In Ghana, our currency got devalued by about 75% over a year. Now, there's so much de-risking you can do to cover that kind of damage. So the question I'm asking is how we can use this forum as a powerful voice to influence, to contribute to better governance and policy making. Otherwise, we'll always be on the back foot, trying to mitigate the damage being done in country. If you look at the problems we're facing on the climate angle, yes, I agree, a lot of it is external, but there are a lot of low-hanging local things we can do. In Ghana, we're burning, in fact, waste management is very bad. They're dumping electronic goods everywhere. The mercury is going to our water bodies, not to speak about the illegal mining that's going on that's damaging all of our water bodies. Now, how do you, in the midst of all these challenges, address that? So there's a lot that within countries we can do to maybe benefit our continent 10 times more than any philanthropy can do, combine external, in-country philanthropy. So what I'd like to suggest that given that philanthropy on the continent is contributing so much, 15% contribution to the philanthropy investments that are coming to our country. And I like to call it investments and not just a contribution, because if we frame it and we position it as investments, then it allows the voice that the philanthropy community has on the continent to speak as investors who are demanding that the right thing be done so that their investments don't go to waste. So what I'm asking this forum is how this community properly positions and influences in-country, regional governments and force them. I mean, we've gotten to the point where we're not suggesting anymore. We're not, encouraging them to do it. We want to develop a voice as investors into these communities where we're demanding that the right thing be done. Because if we did that, what would then happen is that you have a lot more investors seeing that the right thing is being done, the externals, so that they can also feel comfortable in bringing their money. The issue of corruption that Aisha, you mentioned, is a big one. I mean, it's not an issue of just, if anybody is investing, they have the right to ask for proper accounting of how much they've put in that kitty. And so as philanthropists, not only should we demand for our own money to be properly accounted for, but if we're we're looking forward to collaborations that allow us to do more, then that kind of framework allows easy collaboration with other entities, because we're bringing them on board knowing that we're bringing them into a space where their monies will be well utilized as well. So that's what I'm asking. All this is just to say that how do we use this voice to force the biggest risk in our region? Governments, governance, policy making. Because with a stroke of pen, they could correct what climate funds, COP, external philanthropy may never give us in the next 30 years. So that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you. You may go, and I think her statement is very relevant. There was a lot of members of the audience agreeing with you, and the work that you do at Ashesha University is helping us get to that point for the future generation, but we hear you in saying, how do we address the issues that are happening now?
Lots to unpack in what you said, but you've captured the challenge that many governments face, particularly in Africa. I was alluding to the short term, this whole conversation about climate being something we'll do after we've eaten and filled our bellies. It speaks to what you're saying. Many African countries, for instance, in the last few years have faced serious debt sustainability challenges. In the midst of that, where you can't fund your development objectives, you can't fund social infrastructure, you can't fund healthcare. Climate seems like a distant sort of objective. Should we force governments? I think we should encourage governments. And what this platform can do is to showcase where they can be best served. I think public policy is best served to provide enabling environments, not try to do everything by funding, because we don't even have the capacity. We don't have the fiscal capacity to even fund these projects. So public policy should stick around, providing an enabling environment to encourage investors to come and fund. I think we can do better with policy coordination. Give you an example of health. You have a national health policy, you have a national climate adaptation policy, and the two are not speaking together. We have to start making government departments work together. So finance is working with health minister, working with the climate and coming up with solutions that work. And that's why sometimes it looks like they're not thinking, and then they bring out a rule that affects the entrepreneurs you're talking about because they're not sitting together. Bringing in private sector to work with public sector, because it's not in the public sector DNA to work across the silos. But the private sector is used to doing that in creating innovation. And that's why we need sort of private sector in as well. So for me, it would be to encourage public sector, to empower public sector, to tell them that your work or your impact is best served in these areas. If you just do this, it would unlock so much more for you. But I would not disagree that it is challenging. It means we just need to keep talking about it. And that is the power of this convening, to say there's another way that we can sort of, there's another path.
And everybody has their own contribution to make in the roles that
Yes.
they currently have. You want to say something? And
Yeah,
there's somebody
just
who's
to add-
burning to speak right
Very,
there.
very
Yes.
briefly on this, I think just to add on top of what Aisha just said, I think stakeholder engagement and consultation is also powerful in this, and also the embedding and inclusion of gender considerations, of indigenous people's consideration of culture into policy, and also embedding anything climate into any national policy. I think it's time for that because we're talking about a cross-cutting topic. We've been mentioning climate even in yesterday's discussion. So there is this nexus, education, climate, energies that we have to look at by embedding all of these considerations into policy.
Yeah, thank you. This is Tai from Heifer International Africa. So from our years of experience in Africa working in fighting climate change, we've learned that fighting climate change in Africa is not an issue of getting more resource alone. It's about the way we design and the way we deliver on the ground. So we have got a very good experience working with IFAD and government in Africa, co-designing, co-creating a project and co-implementing. Because there is better value and more value when you co-create, rather than bringing like an expert to design, to put a proposal and give it to you to implement. So there is a value addition by co-creating and then co-implementing projects. So it's not an issue of looking for more money, it's also utilizing that scarce resource properly in a way it benefits the most affected people. In a co-design, affected people have voice, private sector have voice. Even the funder sits equally around the table to co-design, comments, feedback. So that's the best approach. So even with the Mode Foundation, which is also sponsoring this event, we have co-designed this year for Uganda around renewable energy, climate smart practices, climate smart livestock practices. So those are very, very helpful. So what we need to advocate on that end. It doesn't come from the without. It requires like an effort to convince our funders, foundations, philanthropic foundations to really come down to those best implementers to co-design, co-create projects for better value. And so we need to advocate that. And probably UNEP is one of the actors who can do more on this. Yes, very easy to announce police station and wait for proposals and just say, they are the best. But it really matters. If you look at the past, I think there are millions and billions of dollars are invested. If you look at what has been the impact, it is the way they were designed and the way they are implemented. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a burning comment right behind him, and then over here and over there.
Good morning, thank you. I'm Abigail Kajumba from Emerging Public Leaders. I'm thinking a lot and really appreciating the comments about working across sectors and also thinking about the non-profit sector where I'm primarily working. So just examples that come to my mind. At Emerging Public Leaders, our sort of flagship program is putting young people through a one-year fellowship in the governments that we partner with, so they're civil servants. And we're looking to do a potential kind of new pilot project where we have a feminist climate advisors within governments. So we like to think we punch above our weight. We're a small NGO, but trying to affect systems change and governance, including in issues around climate and women. I also co-founded a small NGO in Uganda that's growing, we like to say growing rather than planting, superfruit trees in low-income communities with a focus on women and girls. And I'm thinking about a girl, Mary, who came up to us after we did a big planting recently in her school and said, I need more trees. I want to go back to my community, plant fruit trees that can feed our families, that can mitigate climate change. And I want to talk to them about climate solutions. And so they're just two examples of millions across Africa of non-profits being part of the solution, both in terms of governance and systems change to very local solutions that have global impacts. And so as we think about, and I appreciate that comment about the smaller solutions. So as we think about the importance, which, I mean, it's a big problem. So we need to think about big solutions, right? So as we think about private sector and public sector, also just remembering the non-profit sector, whether that impact seems small, but could be multiplied, or we appreciate it as the this part of the solution that it is. And all working together, I think we will get closer to the big solutions, even if they start small, to the big problem. But solution is the answer. Thank you.
Thank you. So not to forget about all actors that have a contribution to play, including the nonprofit sector. Appreciate that reminder of the contribution. So over here, yeah, and then after that, behind. This one first. Sorry, here first. First.
Me?
No, the gentleman right next to, yeah, and then him.
Thank you. My name is Daniel Ikwenabe from Elevate Africa. So I like the point that our sister was talking about earlier on with regards to how to get sustainable implementation of some of these initiatives. And the point that the gentleman made on co-creating and co-designing, co-delivering, because everyone needs to see themselves part of this process. It also requires a bit of collective action and everybody, not just the government, private sector, and then also development partners. But the point I just wanted to make was that we need to keep our eyes on this triangle. The triangle is politics, technical, and then bureaucratic. Now, the leaders in countries really don't care about many of the things we're talking about. So it is our duty to build the political capital and the political incentive for them to make, the right decisions and take the right action. And then once we are able to create that political capital, the technical guys can talk about the rationale, the mechanisms and all of that. It needs to be converted into, or how do we engage the bureaucratic process, because that is how they then implement the policy. So keeping that triage in mind will help us in the way we design, develop, and deliver these programs. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so right behind you, and then, yeah. Oh, you've got the mic? Okay, go ahead. You can go.
Hi, thank you so much for a really engaging discussion this morning. And I think I've been thinking a lot on the points that people have been making, and in particular, the one that was just made now about the role of the NGO world, but also the fact that these issues that we're discussing don't live in bubbles, and I think there is this tendency to silo things, and like you say, government departments who are almost not talking to each other and working with each other. And my name is Mark Nicolishan, and I work for Conservation International. So we really focus on the protection and restoration of nature. And of course, I think people often go to that place where nature almost just lives separate from people and has nothing to do with anybody. But of course, when our organization was founded, the commitment to including indigenous and local communities was, key to everything we do and has been ever since. And I think what we found, particularly an example from Africa, is our Herding for Health program, which is about restoring Africa's degraded rangelands. And of course, it's a conservation project, but 80% of those opportunities that have been provided have gone to women and to young people who now have economic opportunities and choices that they can make, financial autonomy, which just didn't previously exist. So, and of course, it just goes into so many different areas. Like yesterday, we were talking about education. And of course, a friend of mine actually runs the 5 Foundation, which focuses on ending FGM in Somalia. And of course, face value, you wouldn't think our two organizations have much to do with each other. But actually those, financial opportunities now provide a lot of girls and women those opportunities and those choices. And I think choices obviously is the key part. And so I guess As well, I think one point I also wanted to make is on funding that you mentioned of, we really make the point that, flexible funding, unrestricted funding is really a core need of so many organizations. But at the same time, for every, $1 of, private philanthropy, we can leverage that to get $3 of, public, funds. And so I guess my question after those sort of comments is, how can we go further in turning a challenge into an opportunity, and to make sure that it's seen from the governments, but also the business communities as well?
Thank you. That's a very useful comment in terms of looking at this as an integrated whole, but also that there's opportunities for development and economic development in addressing and responding to climate change. So the last question behind you, and then I know we're over time, Minka, forgive me.
Thank you very much. My name is Agri Aluso. I work with Resilience Action Network Africa, as well as Pandemic Action Network. Excuse me. And we've been following this conversation on climate change from a health perspective for quite some time because of its relevance to pandemic threats. And generally, Africa's unique position in this context of climate change. We know in the recent past that Africa has seen a huge surge in disease outbreaks, both infectious disease, vector-borne diseases. And these have, building to the burden that already exists. Africa has 25% of the global disease burden in a very constrained context with low social protection policies. So most of our health costs are borne by people from their out of pocket. So with the surge in climate-sensitive diseases, it's really picking more from the very already depleted pockets of many. And you can imagine how this is deepening the inequalities and the poverty, particularly for the already vulnerable groups like women, who are the frontline health workers, majority, 90% plus. And just the conversation that we now propagate, looking at health in the climate space, mostly it's framed as a co-benefit. But we know from what we've seen lately, health is the human face of climate change. And when it comes to financing conversation, health is never seen as an investment. So when you want to push for investment narrative in climate conversation, you can be sure health-related interventions are not going to be one of the priority benefits. Yet that is where Africa is bearing the brunt in terms of really deepening crisis, economic and social and health crisis. And therefore, in as much as we want to not frame ourselves as victims, but I think there has to be a different argument that should help Africa. Southern and Eastern Africa have been battling cholera for the last 2 years. Now we have Marburg, we have Mpox, we have 100 public health events per year in Africa, increased in about 60% in the last decade between 2012 and 2022. And, with a very fragile health system. So I think there has to be a different argument, even if we want to really portray ourselves as the people who are driving and taking advantage of this financing. It's not going to get to the people on the ground, and it's going to deepen inequalities. And therefore, I think it's not one size fits all. We have to look at all opportunities and look at our unique circumstances and make the right arguments that really build and advance the resilience capacity of our communities. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for making the reminder about discussing climate in all conversations around health system strengthening and response. I know we're over time, so I'm just going to give each of you 15 seconds to wrap up based on all the questions and comments we just received. Sorry about everybody else who had burning questions. We're still here for the rest of the day, but I promised Yinka we'd end on time, and we're a little over. So Aisha, then Yusuf, thank you.
I think the insights from the contributions got to the heart of what we need to do. And I think 70% of the work is recognizing the challenge and talking about it. So I think we're right on our way. My last few words would be, because the title of this session or this forum is a new agenda, right? So just to hone it down for African philanthropists, which areas should you be looking at? Sustainable economic growth, very important. Looking at this as a development opportunity. Climate smart agriculture. I think agriculture, if we can fix that, it helps livelihoods, it helps food security. That's a good area you can invest in. biodiversity and ecosystem restoration. Someone mentioned biodiversity. I think that's important to preserve nature. And lastly, inclusive policies. Include women, include rural people in rural areas, include indigenous people and everyone else, and youth and all of that. And I'm very, very excited about the future of Africa. And I think climate is going to be our pathway to achieving the significant potential that we have on the continent.
Yusuf?
Yeah, just to add on, I think it was also mentioned by one of the colleagues on the co-design of projects and programs. I think it's not bad if we work on, I'd say, on international climate finance, I would say modalities with international donors. I don't think that hurts, but what would hurt is not learning from those programs and not, I would say, acquiring that knowledge and learning so that African, I would say, institutions can co-design together and co-create solutions to address climate change mitigation and adaptation. And that's where I see the role of African philanthropists, is to support that origination of projects and activities that can, again, absorb that financing and translate that financing into implementatable actions. Yeah, so providing seed capital, trainings, educate, convene peer-to-peer exchanges amongst African, I'd say, corporates and private sector organizations. So I still believe that maybe next year, I'll be happy to see that the private sector share in climate financing increasing, and also the role of African philanthropists in that area. Yeah.
So thank you, Yusuf and Aisha, and also thank you to the audience for your time today.